While watching House of the Dragon, I had a déjà vu. I realized that it likely did not learn from the mistakes of its predecessor and is steadily heading towards a similar conclusion. She is written to be extremely inconsistent, seemingly in an attempt to add nuance to her character, but all this does is to make her contradict herself in every step. Trying to add nuance by making the entire thing be a misunderstanding is a cheap writing technique. You only use it if you're too inept as a writer to create actual conflict. Which prompts me to believe that the last shot of rhaenyra actually means nothing. Characters flip-flopping in between their clearly established motivations in the span of several episodes is bad writing. The show is so far at the very beginning of the story, and while some changes cannot be undone, they can be fixed and mended in the following seasons. Unfortunately, it does not seem very likely. We may expect even more inconsistencies in the following seasons, and like with Game of Thrones, they will pile and pile and pile, and more contradictions will appear, and the changes will have a butterfly effect that will explode in our faces in the final season.
That was me looking at the glass candle 3 years ago. I show you this because this video aged exceptionally well, but I do not want to reiterate the same arguments all over again. Instead, I want to revisit House of the Dragon from a different angle. Whenever someone has any criticism of the show, still the default response is to remind them that this is an adaptation, and adaptations change things, and they won't be identical. But with the recent developments in the show, it became clear that many of the show's biggest problems have nothing to do with it being an adaptation at all. Join me as we examine why House of the Dragon doesn't work as a standalone story either. If you end up enjoying this video, consider liking, subscribing and commenting. And if you prefer, you can listen to this on Spotify. Link in the description. The problem that I think had the biggest impact on the show is that we moved through the story too fast. Even the diehard fans of the show tend to agree that there are issues with pacing. The first season covered 20 years, with a 3-year time skip between the Rogue Prince and second of his name, a 10-year time skip between We Light the Way and the Princess and the Queen, and a 6-year time skip between Driftmark and Lord of the Tides. This structure prevents us from properly establishing events, the characters and their relationships, as a lot of them become prominent precisely during the time we don't see. For example, Rhaenyra's decade-long affair with Sir Harwin Strong. The actors do a lot of heavy lifting to sell it, but we do not see Rhaenyra making a decision for Harwin to be the father of her children, why she concluded he's the right fit, and so on. We are introduced to them already having 3 kids together, even if, according to George R.R. Martin, their relationship could fit an entire novella. Harwin dies in the very same episode where his affair with Rhaenyra is revealed, and we don't really feel a lot about it because we weren't given the time necessary to get emotionally invested in him and their relationship. The same applies to some other relationships. Aegon and Rhaenyra do not share a single scene in the story and do not exchange a single word. The 2 claimants to the throne on whom this entire conflict is centered, and I don't even know how they feel about each other. If the show is about fleshing out these historical figures, then how come I know more about their book dynamic than their show dynamic? In the book, I at least know that they didn't get along. In the show, they seem to be on completely neutral terms until the war. This also applies to the rest of Rhaenyra's siblings, with whom she shares 0 scenes until season 3 episode 3, when she briefly talks with Helena. We are meant to believe that Jace and Baela are in love, and while they do share a couple of scenes, I'm not sure what led them to have this affection towards each other, and they do not even share a coy kiss. And then he is dead and Baela is sad, but we do not really feel as if she lost someone she truly loved. Like with Rhaenyra and Harwin, the chemistry between the actors does a lot of work here, but there is only so much they can do with the material, and Baela seems to have moved on from Jace's death suspiciously fast because she now has to develop a relationship with Alan for the purposes of the plot. The audience will not get invested in a relationship if you refuse these relationships to change and evolve, and you won't make it change and evolve if you don't have time to even write it. Much the same can be said about the younger characters. For example, Daemon was not introduced until season 3, and people debated if he even exists in the show's continuity. George R.R. Martin had to confirm that he does, but did not appear in season 1 because of time constraints. Even without Daemon not present in the first 2 seasons, over the course of 2 episodes, multiple kids had to try to establish themselves as characters, get entangled in the political machinations of their mothers, and develop relationships with other characters. and it was simply not possible to give an equal amount of time to everyone in the span of a 10-hour season of television, where they crammed 20 years. I think by far the most outrageous is the treatment of the Dragon sisters, they're not twins in the show by the way, who will be the last ones standing after the dust settles. Imagine how much more people would care about Baela and rhaenyra if we got to see them grow and have some semblance of a relationship with their father and each other. Imagine if we got to see Rhaenyra and Baela bond with Jace and Luke, so that you feel something when they grieve for them. We're by season 3 and there was still a disproportionate lack of attention given to them. Bethany Antonia, who portrays Baela, pointed out that what was challenging was figuring out what her position would be if she wasn't associated to certain characters. What does she stand for? So far, all we've seen of Baela is her doing what other people expect of her, or trying to protect other people. I think this season I was sort of faced to confront the fact that, as an individual, we haven't seen her do anything for herself, or born out of her own interests or desires. Even those characters who did receive some attention could have been explored more if it wasn't for the time constraint. Just imagine how much harder Jace's death would have hit if you could see him grow from a child to a young man, see him treat with Rhaenyra, and develop a real friendship with grrm. The youngest characters in the show were also similarly neglected, as we barely get to spend time with Aegon and Viserys, or Jacaerys and Jaehaera. With Jacaerys, the show does something similar as with Harwin. It gives prominence to him in the very same episode that he dies. And while his death is horrible, you don't feel bad because you had time to grow to care for him, but because he is a child. Compare this to the original Game of Thrones. It also ends with the launch of the Civil War, but the difference is, the setup for it does not take 20 years of simmering resentments. The first season actually shows people talking, developing them and their relationships, and they drive the story forward rather than being reluctantly dragged through pre-decided plot beats. You can't have the Dance of the Dragons without those 2 or so decades of simmering resentments and the children inheriting the feud of their mothers. This is like if the creators of Game of Thrones decided to speedrun the entirety of the War of the Five Kings so that they can get the Red Wedding by the end of season 1. My biggest solution to that ever since the first season was to move the actual Civil War further back and dedicate at least 2 seasons to establishing these characters, their loyalties, their relationships, and their factions. In my vision, the war would have started by the end of season 2 at the earliest, and some of my attempts at rewrites actually had it start by the end of season 3. But as we know, the milk has already been spilled. What's even more bizarre is that the writers allegedly wanted to start the story even later. Ideas floated around to start with Viserys' death. Imagine if we didn't get Paddy Considine as Viserys. And I will preemptively disagree with those who claim that the show wouldn't be as popular if the setup took up more seasons. What made Game of Thrones so special weren't shock value deaths or battle scenes. It was political intrigue, people talking in rooms, seeing these characters and their relationships unfold. But it's clear that the writers were simply disinterested in the setup for this devastating civil war because they wanted to depict the cool stuff. But the cool stuff will fall flat when everything is rushed and you're not emotionally invested. Fans often argue about who is the best character in the story, taking various considerations into account. Many name Daemon for his chaotic energy, Aemond for his aura, rhaenyra for her status as a protagonist, and so on. I would actually divorce the I like this character the most from this character is best written, because those are separate concepts. My favorite character is Baela, but I don't think she's the best written, since she is severely neglected by the writers, and I just project book Baela onto Bethany Antonia. I actually think the best written character in House of the Dragon is Viserys Targaryen, for no other reason that he has a complete character arc, with a consistent personality, goals and motivations that don't change every 2 episodes. Viserys lacks a male heir, butchers his first wife to get him, she and the baby die, after which, against all precedent, he names Rhaenyra as heir. Viserys will spend the rest of the season in effectively mending the conflict he caused by marrying Alicent and creating competing claims for Rhaenyra. We reach the climax of his arc when he takes one last stance in defense of his daughter and makes one last attempt at reconciling the 2 branches of the House of the Dragon. But it is too late, as the animosity of the mothers had already poisoned the children. Viserys dies, the storm breaks, and the dragons dance. For these reasons, I would not hesitate to call Viserys the actual protagonist of Season 1 of House of the Dragon. The show would have been the masterpiece everyone claims it to be had everyone been written like this, but unfortunately, their goals, motivations, and even personalities changed without sufficient triggers. In one of my previous videos, I had argued against the claim seen across multiple fandoms that such shifts are a sign of complexity. In actuality, they are signs of inconsistency, and inconsistency is not complexity. While real human beings are indeed inconsistent and contradictory, characters are not real people, but tools of the narrative. If their goals, motivations, and personalities are to shift, the narrative must provide them a compelling reason. The character most emblematic of the problem of shifting goals and motivations is Alicent Hightower, who takes over her father's plan to put her son Aegon on the throne. When reintroduced as an adult, it's made abundantly clear that Alicent spent her time off-screen undermining Rhaenyra's position at court and inflaming the rumors of the true paternity of her children. Most importantly, she turns her eldest against Rhaenyra and her children, claiming that he is a challenge to Rhaenyra's claim. After Driftmark, it's clear that the affection they once held for one another has been gone for years. Alicent's plans fall apart once Viserys reaffirms Lucerys' inheritance. After years of plotting, instead of crashing out, Alicent accepts the state of affairs with no resistance. She then misunderstands the last words of her husband and gets convinced that on his deathbed he named Aegon as heir, even though there is no reason for her to believe it, given that Viserys never changed his mind and reaffirmed her succession while being a rotting corpse. When I initially watched this episode, I was convinced that Alicent just heard what she wanted to hear, but the subsequent season made it clear that it was not the case. Alicent's goals and her motivations that she's had for 16 years crumbled like a house of cards, and I fail to see a compelling reason that wouldn't be a headcanon or a heavy extrapolation. She will spend the rest of her screen time trying to prevent something she's already put in motion. There is a very good reason as to why Alicent in episodes 5, 6, 7 and the first half of episode 8 of season 1 is at her peak as a character. She has a goal and is relentless in pursuing it. But the second half has her regress completely, as if she was possessed by her child self, and the rest of the show has her sulking and going on pointless side quests, with her character losing any sense of purpose. Now that her goals align with that of the protagonists, she is completely redundant. Daemon suffers from this problem too. For the majority of season 1, he is pretty consistent in terms of personality, motivations and goals, first chasing the crown for himself and then accepting his wife's ascension. Then, in season 2, Daemon decides that he will rally an army for his own sake. Why? We don't know, we can only extrapolate. After a redundant season-long ayahuasca trip, Daemon once more decides to support Rhaenyra because he saw some vision. Thus, twice his goals have changed without sufficient explanation. Sometimes these characters don't even seem to have a clear goal. For example, what is the goal of Rhaenys Targaryen? What reason does she have to support Rhaenyra, given the kind of relationship she and Corlys had with her, which would indicate they should stay neutral? Oh wait, they can't, because Rhaenys has to die in Rook's Rest, so Rhaenys decides to support Rhaenyra because she's shown restraint, and then goes to Rook's Rest, defeats Aegon, has a chance to escape, but returns. Why? We don't know, and can only speculate. Her character is aimless because we don't know what she actually wants. When I watch the show, I have the impression that every 2 episodes, characters are visited by the Men in Black. Monumental events are forgotten. The decisions and behaviors of the characters are not informed by their past experiences, but by what the plot requires. As such, the show does not feel like a continuous story, but a set of scenes existing in vacuums. For example, remember when in season 1 a giant dragon burst to the floor? There were no consequences to that whatsoever, and Ryan Condal said that
Melius is a beloved dragon that...
Or when Aegon raped a servant and enjoyed watching children fight to the death, but the subsequent seasons treat him as a great guy. Or when Rhaenyra was incapacitated with grief following Luke's death, but moved on approximately 1 episode later. Or when Helena's son was beheaded, but she seemed to have moved on from it swimmingly. Before season 2 of House of the Dragon premiered, blood and cheese was on everyone's lips, as it is one of the most shocking and horrifying moments in the entire war. The sequence left much less emotional impact than it should have, and Jacaerys' death does not reverberate, even though it was used for propaganda purposes to name Rhaenyra the Cruel and a Kinslayer, all while no one ever names Aemond a Kinslayer. I'm willing to let it slide that the small folk kind of don't care about this anymore, as they are quite fickle, but what I do not let slide is that the child's mother grieves for a bit and then forgets about it. She even speaks to the man who had her son beheaded like it's a glass candle FaceTime, and giddily orders the city to surrender to the faction that killed her son, holding no resentment towards them whatsoever. And if you want to claim that this is because she's coded as neurodivergent, there's neurodivergence and there's writing Helena as if she was completely unaware of what's happening around her. Neurodivergent people are capable of thinking, having emotions, and a logical causation effect chains in their heads. Helena is just a caricature. This lack of continuity makes it so that some relationships in this story clearly stagnate. Think about the best relationships you ever saw depicted in narrative media, be it romantic, familial, or platonic. One of the aspects that makes them so compelling was change. Depending on external circumstances, the individual actions, and the things they do to each other, these relationships were changing, evolving, or devolving. But every time you would expect the central relationships of the story to do so, the show always reverses them back on step one. Alicent and Rhaenyra's relationship should have lost all trace of affection a long time ago. But just when you think that they might finally become enemies, the show tries to get you invested in the idea that they can still be friends. It does not evolve irrespective of the fact that their falling out happened 2 decades and 3 dead kids ago. Whenever the writers have a chance, they regress them both back to their child selves and completely ignore how both of them changed, how their relationship changed, as well as how other events should take priority ahead of their childhood friendship. This only makes sense if you watch with cheaper glasses. Rhaenyra seems to hold very little resentment towards Alicent for everything she and her faction put her through. Just when you think that in season 2 finale she will finally snap and tell Alicent to get fucked, she once more gets teary-eyed and trusts a woman that's instrumental to all the problems she's facing. And how can she cry about the deaths of her children in one scene and then express no resentment towards Otto, who's been trying to usurp her for 2 decades and whose actions led directly to Luke's and Jace's deaths, as well as Visenya, but she's forgotten the moment she's buried. Cry as she beheads him and look at Alicent with guilt once she makes it to the throne room. And Alicent sells out her entire family sans Helena to end the war, but then gets outraged when Otto is killed. Rhaenyra is once more not allowed to tell her to get fucked, and again looks guilty. And after all of this, she still has Alicent advise her. I could name examples upon examples upon examples of this, but all of this can be summed up by the fact that the show simply lacks continuity, some glue that would tie these scenes together, because the showrunners themselves forget what happened before. Conflict is the very foundation of every story ever written. More specifically, conflicts are those events in the story that delay the characters from reaching their goals. The very basis of good writing are conflicts that happen organically. House of the Dragon always had problems with depicting conflict. I was broadly able to see 2 patterns: the sudden interruption of conflicts and enforcing artificial conflicts because the plot requires them. In the time skip between We Light the Way and The Princess and the Queen, Alicent and Rhaenyra find themselves at opposing sides. Alicent wants her son to inherit the throne at Rhaenyra's expense and spends 16 years in pursuit of said goal, while Rhaenyra wants to ascend. But as we already went over, when all her plans are squandered, Alicent just accepts this state of affairs, only proceeds because of a misunderstanding, and later backs away from that goal. This is what artificially cuts her conflict with Rhaenyra and the Black faction short and makes her character static and aimless, which is all that more frustrating given that the marketing positions her as the leader of her faction. An example of an inorganic conflict is Jacaerys locking Rhaenyra in her chambers to prevent her from flying to the gullet. Due to the line set by Rhaenyra that we will discuss later, this is probably meant to be perceived as Jace weaponizing patriarchal control over his mother. In reality, Jace is right in this situation, and on numerous fronts. From Jace's perspective, Rhaenyra can't be trusted to make some decisions at the moment, as she is giddily suggesting they take King's Landing because a woman who spent 10 years bullying his entire family said they can waltz in and be done with it. More importantly though, the Blacks cannot lose Rhaenyra. There is a reason why Aegon going to fight at Rook's Rest was such a bad idea. It left him bedridden for weeks and almost dead. It's also not true that Rhaenyra is prevented from fighting because she's a woman, for the simple reason that Rhaenys and Baela, who are both women, participate respectively in Rook's Rest and the Gullet. If Rhaenyra is angry that she can't fight because she's a queen, then she should abdicate. In fact, her lack of decisiveness in season 2 is what made her separate internal conflict seem inorganic, because she had a solution just lying on the ground but couldn't pick it up, because then we wouldn't have the story. Just abdicate. But due to the fact that Aegon and Viserys are safely in the Vale now, because the time skips and changes in plotlines made it so that they are respectively 2 and 4, and the dragon seeds are on a side quest in Harrenhal, Jace needs another reason to fly to the Khaled, so the show creates this plot contrivance to have him die. In some instances, inorganic conflicts and shifting characterizations overlap, such as in the case of Corlys's and Rhaenyra's conflict in season 3. When Corlys wants Adam and Alan legitimized, Rhaenyra refuses on the assumption that she can't because the rumors of her children's paternity could still endanger her, but with the way she speaks about it, she's open to consider this in the future when the throne is more secure. This may seem logical at first glance, but in reality, the only reason for her refusal is because there is a need for conflict between her and Corlys. Because why would Rhaenyra legitimizing Adam and Alan put suspicion on her own sons? Plenty of monarchs legitimized bastards. Tommen, who himself was born out of wedlock, legitimized Ramsay. Legitimizing Adam and Alan is a very logical thing to do. Joffrey is now heir to the throne. Aegon and Viserys have no claim to Driftmark, but someone has to inherit it, and Alan is a logical choice. Once again, the real reason why Rhaenyra refuses is to create inorganic conflict between her and Corlys, even though she has no good reason to actually refuse him. Subsequently, Corlys joins our pantheon of inconsistency and has a drastic change of character. Corlys loved his grandsons even if they were not biologically his. In season 1, he says that history does not remember blood, but names. So for him to suddenly say that Lucerys and Jacaerys lived and died as bastards, especially after Jacaerys died in defense of his fleet, is a major shift in his character that exists for no other reason than to induce fake conflict. Even though, once again, from the way Rhaenyra said this, it was not "I will not do it," but "not now." And Corlys screaming this in the middle of the Red Keep with multiple people present makes me think that he has an early onset dementia. Worse yet, the situation is written to show Rhaenyra as a hypocrite, but if anyone is a hypocrite in this scenario, it's Corlys. Rhaenyra loved and cherished her children and had them with Laenor's blessing, as they were both free to pursue their own romances outside of marriage. By contrast, Corlys cheated on the wife he supposedly loved more than anything, left the boys to their own devices, and only reappeared when he needed heirs. The show also forgets how much Corlys was grasping for the Iron Throne all throughout season 1, and how the marriage to Rhaenyra made it so that Laenor would one day be king. But because the show will not present him as in the wrong, it flies under the radar. User Ace with a pencil on Twitter made a good point about this scene. The show's argument scenes are still stilted as fuck because one character is usually written with 2 hands tied behind their back, in the sense they're not allowed to bring up any of the counter-argument elephants in the room. That's exactly the Rhaenyra and Corlys scene, and frankly most scenes with Rhaenyra. Her arguments with other characters usually have her clearly positioned as in the wrong, but because she is not actually in the wrong a lot of the times, she is not allowed to snap and say "get fucked" and respond to accusations in kind. This happens twice in the same episode. Alicent is angry at Rhaenyra for killing Otto, who is a traitor to the crown, but Rhaenyra is prevented from saying anything back. For example, "I don't know, you plotted against me for 2 decades, you made my life living hell for those 2 decades, your faction usurped me, which resulted in my stillbirth, your faction sent assassins for me, your son killed my son, your faction's fleet killed my other son." Rhaenyra has her hands tied because continuity only goes 2 episodes back maximum, and the show desperately wants you to take Alicent's side and show Rhaenyra as compromised. Here I will briefly bring up the books to show you an example on how good conflict actually works, because in the books, Corlys and Rhaenyra also have a falling out. You can skip to the next section if you don't want to listen to me talk about the books, but it is actually somewhat relevant to the subject of this video. This whole Corlys business is yet another instance of toxic butterflies. These showrunners need to meet certain plot beats from the book, but change everything that leads to them. In the book, Rhaenyra and Corlys do have conflict, and it's because of Rhaenys' death. And Jace, who is still alive at that point, reconciles them by naming Corlys' hand. Jace was the one who ultimately convinced Rhaenyra to legitimize Adam and Alan, who in the books Corlys presents as Laenor's illegitimate children, though nobody really believes that. Rhaenyra and Corlys have another falling out after Ulf's and Hugh's betrayal that results in her becoming paranoid against the dragon seeds, including Adam. Rhaenyra orders Adam arrested, but Corlys warns him and gets imprisoned, making Rhaenyra lose support. Corlys then turns the cloaks for the Greens, but not because we need another Rhaenyra humiliation ritual, but because he wants to end the war and save Baela, who at that point was imprisoned by the Greens. But since now Ulf and Hugh are small folk champions and not deranged rapists, they need another reason for Corlys to turn cloaks, so they invent artificial conflict between him and Rhaenyra. But again, why the hell wouldn't Rhaenyra agree to them being legitimized? As opposed to genuine conflict, a lot of the problems characters face stem from misunderstandings and accidents. We already went over Alicent misunderstanding Viserys' last words. Blood and cheese, which was teased as the equivalent of the Red Wedding, left very little impact also because it was the result of yet another misunderstanding. Rhaena accidentally caused Jace's death. This will in turn impact Rhaena's character going forward, not something she did out of her own volition, but a mistake she's made by accident. The sheer amount of accidents makes people wonder if Rhaenyra's death won't be an accident as well. But I still think that the worst case of accidents driving the plot is Luke's death. Aemond and Lucerys meet at Storm's End. Aemond demands Lucerys' eye for the one he took when they were kids. Then Aemond chases Lucerys on the biggest dragon in the world, screaming that he owes a debt, and then is horrified when Vhagar kills Lucerys. After the Season 1 finale, showrunner Ryan Condal had so justified the choice to rely on accidents and misunderstandings. Historians have told us that Aemond intended to kill Luke, but I don't think any of them could purport to know what was going on in Aemond's head at the time. And I would also dispute the word accident a bit. I mean, Aemond got on his giant dragon and chased his nephew on a much smaller dragon through the clouds, screaming and yelling at him, incensing his dragon and starting a fight. He didn't know how Arrax or Luke were going to respond, and it ended in tragedy. I don't think that was what Aemond intended when he threw his leg over the saddle, but he did a horrible, dangerous thing. That is the point. This is a war of many cuts that lead to a really, really bloody wound. It adds complexity and nuance to the character that's potentially interesting. There's lots of runway to go on with Aemond as a character and the story of the dance. This is his first act as a dragon rider and a warrior, and it's gone very wrong. Now, what happens as a result and how does he respond? Those are the questions I'm interested in as dramaticist. The thing worth asking ourselves here is about this part. I don't think any of them could purport to know what was going on in Aemond's head at the time. We actually can. When you chase an envoy on a much smaller dragon and insist he owes a debt, then you do it with an intent to kill or harm. If Aemond tried to argue that it was an accident in the court of law, nobody would have bought that. Not if multiple people saw him threaten Luke in Storm's End. Why was he chasing him if he didn't want him to die? Just to scare him? A very small group of people, myself included, have warned since Season 1 that if the show keeps committing to using accidents and misunderstandings to drive the plot, it will go downhill. In response, we've heard the usual mantra of complexity, nuance, plausible deniability, and the thought-terminating cliches of a dragon is not a slave and the idea that we control the dragons is an illusion. Seth Abramson was another person who questioned the decision to have this monumental event reduced to an accident. I had the chance to study creative writing at the Iowa Writers' Workshop in the late 2000s, and honestly I never heard a fiction writer taking fiction workshops there say that as a literary artist, their focus is on accidents and how people respond to them. The reason for this, I imagine, is that by definition, accidents do not in themselves reveal character. Having a character be defined by his or her response to events they did not intend makes that character wholly reactive and therefore, in one sense at least, flat. Abramson noted that retro and variety were about the only outlets to notice the bizarre nature of this narrative choice. And me, but back then I had 17 subscribers and even now I doubt Condal and crew watch my videos. Well, look at us now. One accident or one misunderstanding is fine. One of the best seasons of television ever produced relies on an accident as the inciting incident. But the difference between Aemond and Powder is that Powder moved with intent. Her desire to help her family had unforeseen consequences. Moreover, Powder was a much smaller child, and although show Aemond is only 16, he is much more capable of predicting the consequences of his actions, especially given his clear murderous intent, as opposed to the desire to help. And do you know why Condal hadn't corrected the course? Because only two outlets were willing to ask whether this narrative choice makes sense. Everyone praised him, his nuanced and complex and tragic version of the dance of the misunderstandings, so he was emboldened to think that he will receive the same praise for the same developments. but over-reliance on accidents and misunderstandings only served to reveal his weaknesses as a writer. User CrucialMe on Twitter summed it up best. The show is not a character drama about an entitled family tearing itself apart over medieval inheritance law like it's supposed to be adapting. Instead, it is about overly incompetent people stumbling into a series of accidents that led them to disaster that's not their fault. In the premiere of Season 3, Rhaenyra Targaryen is locked in her chambers by her own son to prevent her from taking part in the upcoming Battle of the Gauntlet. Rhaenyra then breaks down, starts stabbing her dress and whimpers, "I may appear to have the weak and feeble body of a woman, but I possess the heart and spirit of a king." This is a reference to a quote from Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen of England. It comes from her speech to the troops at the Tilbury in August of 1588, in preparation for the incoming Spanish Armada. The full quote is, "I know I have the body but of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And think full scorn that Parma or Spain, or any prince of Europe, should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field." The invasion was subsequently repelled. Now, it seems to me that although these are broadly the same words, the context is so different that they are nothing alike. Elizabeth is rallying her troops whilst Rhaenyra is sobbing in a castle. Both position their female bodies as weak, but Elizabeth does actually have the heart and stomach of a king, while Rhaenyra is weak in spirit. This has been true about her for most of Season 1, most of Season 2, and, as of now, the initial episodes of Season 3. I believe this is the best illustration of the problems plaguing how the show writes women. On one hand, the story wants to be about misogyny and the patriarchy, but on the other, it perceives them in a very one-dimensional way. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to critique the way Rhaenyra and other women in this story are written, because it will be met with resistance about how what happens to them is realistic because the show is about the patriarchy and misogyny. The issue is that merely depicting something is not automatically equivalent to doing it well. Notice how Elizabeth I was still constrained by patriarchal expectations placed upon her, how she acknowledged said constraints by claiming that she has a feeble body of a woman, but still asserted herself as the figure of authority and successfully rallied her troops. That's what women have historically been doing, because even with these expectations and limitations in place, they didn't fully cave into them. They sought power, authority, were active, ambitious, and had agency. By contrast, House of the Dragon depicts its women, especially their two female leads, as entirely passive, reactive, weak, indecisive, and lacking ambition. This they attribute not to their inability to perceive women as three-dimensional human beings, but to the patriarchy. Simultaneously, the show shies away from presenting the patriarchy as a force that actually impacts the stakes of the show. There are occasional appeals to the fact that the war had started due to Rhaenyra's sex, but it is not truly felt, as it's downplayed at every opportunity. It's not about Rhaenyra's sex, it's about bastards. It's not about Rhaenyra's sex, it's about a bunch of misunderstandings. It's not about Rhaenyra's sex, it's about how men started all of it and she is just helpless to stop it and must do their bidding. The show will, for example, have Rhaenyra spitting bars about how if she was a man, she could father dozens of bastards, with nobody batting an eye, and Viserys answering that it's true, but she's a woman, and therefore it's different. But at the same time, the show validates Viserys' words by treating Rhaenyra as morally compromised for having children out of wedlock. The extension to treating the patriarchy as something nebulous and poorly defined is that both the system and the misogyny it produces are mostly reduced to interpersonal conflicts between the characters, and not even the conflict between the characters of the faction that champions the patriarchy and the one that wants to see the woman ascend, but between the individual members of the latter. This is evident by framing Jace's refusal to let Rhaenyra participate in the Gauntlet as an expression of patriarchal control, which results in that laughable whimper from her. House of the Dragon seems to believe that the only way for women to be likable is when they are innocent, reactive victims. But that is and has never been true. People are exhausted by it. They point out the contradictions. They dislike these narrative choices. Likeable is not a synonym for good. Sure, people are much harsher on female characters, but why should that paralyze you? You will not challenge anything if you're terrified of whether the audience will like your characters, and by trying to make them likable, you will end up with the opposite effect. Game of Thrones was not without its flaws when it comes to misogynistic writing, but at the very least, we could see the many and various women and their relationships to power. Those who seek it using subtle political scheming, those who seek it by traditional military command, those who are disinterested in it, and so on. In House of the Dragon, 0 women are interested in power and wielding it, and in each and every one of these cases, this reluctance is attributed to the patriarchy. But even real-life patriarchy was not short of women who sought and wielded power in spite of the constraints placed on their sex. Just think of Elizabeth I, Cleopatra, Victoria, Jadwiga, Theodora, Empress Matilda, and numerous others. Even if historically they were the exception, shouldn't Rhaenyra be that exception as opposed to a whimpering fool? Acting like all women of the past must have been passive bystanders in their own lives the way Alicent and Rhaenyra are, is not only unrealistic, but simply misogynistic. And outside of misogyny, it's just boring. The people long for decisive Rhaenyra. Unfortunately, if Rhaenyra really delivered this speech in the same context as Elizabeth, she would have probably been disparagingly called a girl boss by those very same people who appeal to the patriarchy and misogyny. At the end of the day, House of the Dragon reduces all of its women to one exact type and tells you this is all what women have historically been, and that this reductive view is actually feminist. I would not be myself if I hadn't bitched a bit, so let me do it here. If you actually want these two mediums to be treated as completely separate, then start with yourself, because every time book fans complain about substantial changes to the source material that completely alter the core of the story, rather to remind us that these are separate canons, show fans tend to go, well, it could have been like that in the books too. Throw a stone if you hadn't seen this yourself. The show is how it really happened. The show is the true version of the story. Before House of the Dragon, nobody argued that Daemon killed Rhaenyra. After House of the Dragon, suddenly everyone believed it to be plausible, especially since Ryan Condal's justification was,
There was this line in the book that always fascinated me. Daemon's wife, the Lady Rhaenyra of Runestone, fell off her horse and her skull was crushed in the fall. And I read that and I was like, that's such a weird detail to include with no context around it. So I stared at it and I was like, well, Daemon obviously went home and murdered his wife.
Even though there is plenty of context in this particular scene in Fire and Blood that decisively excludes Daemon as the culprit. Before House of the Dragon, nobody positioned Alicent as a helpless victim. But after the image of book Alicent and book Viserys was overwritten by Emily and Paddy, when in the book they look closer to Emily and Tom, suddenly everyone insists that book Alicent was also forced to marry Viserys against her will, she was also a helpless victim, and so on. Similarly, before House of the Dragon, nobody ever questioned the authority Alicent and Rhaenyra wielded in their respective factions. Now, after so much of it has been outsourced to the men around them, suddenly questions are placed as to whether they had as much power as they did in the books, with the go-to excuse being, well, the book was written by men, so who is to say they hadn't blamed women for XYZ? This reached a point where Rhaenyra's canon personality is questioned as well. Oh, the Maesters wrote her this way, she wasn't actually like this. Even though George R.R. Martin gave a detailed description of Rhaenyra's personality years before he wrote The Princess and the Queen, and what he said is perfectly consistent with it. And speaking of George, Hot Tea fans weirdly care about what he has to say about the show, even though they constantly announce that they believe his version of the story to be vastly inferior. And now, after the Gauntlet, we have yet another contender, what people dubbed as Mandela effect regarding Jace's motivation for participation in the Gauntlet. Before the show, everyone was in agreement that Jace flew so low because he was trying to find the captured Viserys. Now that Viserys and Aegon were out of the Gauntlet, Jace instead flew to prove himself, and the agreement shaped into, well, who is to say that this was not his motivation in the books as well? If in one breath you are mad at book fans bringing up the books, but in the other you match the show and the books yourself, then you are not sticking to your principles. Your response to book fans bringing up the books should be, these are separate canons, not, this could have gone like this in the books as well. And Condal and the rest should do it too. Over the course of this video, we've run into multiple instances of him using the books as a crutch. And why does he and his fans do this? Because they need the legitimacy of the books, else this show falls apart like a badly set Jenga tower. And the only thing that still hangs this show by the thread is that the books provide some sort of a template on how are you supposed to feel about these people, the events they take part in, their relationships, and what might have happened behind the scenes. If House of the Dragon is truly a completely separate story, only loosely adapted from Fire and Blood, then it should have been written and directed with this in mind. That is, for people completely unfamiliar with the source material. The reality is, the writers deny it as they may, but they do rely on your knowledge of the book. This is why Ryan Condal skipped everything that made the story work and forced the audience to either fill in the blanks themselves or refer them back to the books. That's why it's not true when people say that he fleshed out the characters. From the perspective of the show alone, Condal and his team cut everything crucial to the setup of the Dance of the Dragons, such as the genesis of the Blacks and the Greens, and neglected the development of several characters critical to the later stages of war because he assumed his show will be watched with the books in mind. And this is why I did this analysis, because without the books to back it all up, the show makes even less sense. This is why Condal refers back to it whenever he can. This is why people merge these two mediums and insist that it could have been like this in the books as well. Because deep inside, you guys also know this does not make sense. But the more the show deviates from the source material, the less you have these books as a crutch, and the more these characters are completely unrecognizable. People it makes sense themselves into this during season 1, where Condal was first assured and reassured that his narrative decisions make sense. That's how we got season 2, George's crash out, and now season 3, which is on the straight path to crash and burn. I'm glad that more and more people are opening their eyes. Too late, but at least I can say the one thing everyone hates to hear. I told you so. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider sticking around by subscribing. Likes and comments are also appreciated. And remember, Phoenix rises from the ashes, and ashes stand on top.
Mm-hmm.